everybody. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of our literary events here at the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center. Welcome to our new semester of Women on the Move, where we talk to top authors and we talk to them about their careers and their latest books. As always, I'd like to thank the Samuel I. Newhouse Foundation for this support of this series. Starting today and for the next 7 weeks, we're going to host top authors, so please join us every week. Today, though, is very special as we have the pleasure of hosting Dara Horn, author of 6 award-winning books and numerous literary awards. Today, though, we're here to discuss her latest book, People Love Dead Jews. In conversation with Dara is her sister, Dara Horn, also a writer and podcast host of the Kveller.com podcast Call Your Mother podcast on Kveller.com. This should be a fabulous conversation between the Horn sisters. And please ask your questions in the chat feature of Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dara and Jordana. Hello, ladies.
Hi, Marjorie. Hi, Dara.
Jordana, hi, Dara. Please enjoy your conversation.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for that introduction, Marjorie. I love doing these interviews, and perhaps especially so today, when I get to talk to one of my absolutely favorite live Jews, my sister, Dara Horn. And yes, Mom, I know you're out there and we're both wearing makeup and lipstick. We have a lot to cover here. I want to make sure to get to some audience questions at the end. So I'm going to be a bit of a traffic cop, Dara, because you and I could talk about these issues, which are so important to both of us, literally for days. But I wanted to start by saying that you've said in interviews before that you spent 20 years of your career actively not writing this book. So if you could just talk a little bit about what that means, what led you to put out these essays, as a book. And let's just throw in a little synopsis for the people who may be here who haven't yet gotten a chance to read.
Sure. So I just want to say first, thank you to everyone at the Streicker Center for inviting me. And Jordana, it is awesome to be here with you. We considered doing this like sitting on the couch together instead of being in separate boxes. It was too awkward technically, but I'm really delighted to be here today. So yes, I spent 20 years not writing this book. And what I mean by that is I've published 5 novels prior to this book. They all deal really deeply with Jewish history and culture. I have a doctorate in Yiddish and Hebrew literature. My whole career, I was pushing against the idea that Jewish identity should be defined from the outside. So much so that when I would do public events for my books, I often would ask the audience, how many people here can name 3 concentration camps? Something a lot of people can do. I then asked those same people, how many people here can name 3 Yiddish writers? And my question is why do we care about how these people died if we don't care how they lived? I now look back at that and I think I was a little naive because I didn't appreciate what really is the structure of this new book, which is the role that dead Jews play in the wider world's imagination. And I got to this point, I sort of hit a wall with this in 2018, because in 2018, Smithsonian Magazine approached me and asked me to do a piece for them about Anne Frank. And I got this request, and I know Jordana will appreciate this. I was sort of like, ugh, I really don't want to write an essay about Anne Frank. And, the normal thing to do would be to turn this assignment down. We're writers, we're not normal people. Instead, what I thought is, actually, one thing I've learned in my life as a writer is that the uncomfortable moments are usually where the story is. And so I thought, this is interesting. Why don't I want to do this? And then I remembered a news story that I had read about something that happened at the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam. This was in 2018, there was a young Jewish man who worked at that museum, and the museum would not allow him to wear his yarmulke to work. They made him hide it under a baseball hat. He appealed this decision to the board of the museum. The board of the museum then deliberated for 4 months until finally relenting and allowing him to wear his yarmulke to work. And I had read this news story and I just thought, 4 months is a really long time for the Anne Frank house to ponder whether or not to force a Jew into hiding. And I thought, there's something going on here. And it's that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves, but that also require living Jews to erase themselves in order for that conversation to happen. So I did write that piece for Smithsonian, and the first line of that piece, which it's now the first chapter of this book, is people love dead Jews, living Jews, not so much. I sort of thought this was like a little blip in my life, and I would then go back to just writing novels and teaching Yiddish. But what happened was that piece came out about, it was like a week before the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And it was within hours of that attack, the New York Times called me. They're like, no, would you like to write about dead Jews? And what I realized is, as I put it,
would I?
I'm like, I'm your woman. And you know what I became, in the book I say, I became like the go-to person for the emerging literary genre of synagogue shooting op-eds. I was like, I didn't apply for this job.
Yeah.
And yes, well, I just thought, there's something going on here. This is the only thing my editors at mainstream publications want me to write about is dead Jews. And so I sort of decided at that point, like, instead of avoiding this subject, like I did for 20 years, I just wanted to lean hard into this and sort of explore where this goes and really this role that dead Jews play in this larger world's imagination.
Yes. And I have to say, I have to throw in here, and I'm sure that there's at least one person in this vast audience watching us today who had a visceral reaction to that being the title, People Love Dead Jews. I've actually been in Facebook groups where people have said, how despicable, I would never read a book with that title. And I had to tell them that rather than picketing the synagogue where you would be speaking, perhaps they should look into the actual subject. But I'm surprised that the publisher allowed that title to, because what's it like for people reading this book on the beach or on a plane?
I had one interviewer who I made that comment to, and he was like, are you kidding? I want to take the cover of this book and put it on any other book that I happen to be reading, because I want to have a lot of more space to sit on the subway.
Yes, that's true. It does give you a lot of space on the subway. And so that leads me nicely into my next question, which is, if you could just talk a little bit about, it's a two-tiered question, because I'd love to hear about the Jewish reaction to your book and the non-Jewish reaction to your book, both things that you anticipated and things that maybe you didn't.
Sure. So just to answer the other question, not flippantly, but the title, I actually expected more pushback from my publisher, and they went with it. And I now have learned that they did have some internal meetings about it. I actually have a little theory about this, which is that the people who worked on this book, my publisher is Norton. The people who worked on this book are not Jewish. So my editor is not Jewish, the publicist, other people in the marketing team, these people don't happen to be Jewish. And I kind of think maybe that's why they let me get away with the title. Maybe they kind of felt like it wasn't their place to, edit my voice or something. But look, if the title makes you uncomfortable, that's entirely intentional, because if you're uncomfortable with the title, you're going to be really uncomfortable with everything else that I'm exposing.
So true.
Yes. True. So, and that's really what's sort of been to me most sort of interesting and also shocking about the response to the book. For people who made it past the title, there's sort of there's a positive and a negative to this. And what I have found, the thing that has been sort of, really sort of upsetting to me is the response I've gotten from Jewish readers. And when I say upsetting, I mean, most people have appreciated the book, and that's wonderful. But in a sense, I wish people liked it a little bit less, because I wrote this book as really an intellectual exploration. It wasn't about sort of my personal, emotional life. It was really about a phenomenon I had noticed in my work as a scholar, as a writer, as a travel writer. But what happened was, after I published this book, I now receive I've received hundreds and hundreds of messages from Jewish readers from all walks of life, secular people, religious, old, young, in America, around the world. They all writing me exactly the same message, which says, I felt uncomfortable my whole life and I never understood why. This book articulated this for me. Thank you. Then they say, I never told anyone this, but. And then they tell me this long, depressing story about some degrading experience they've had in their own life with anti-Semitism. And this has been really shocking to me, because I now have become the receptacle for this enormous amount of really unarticulated pain in the Jewish community. That's been, really sort of upsetting to me, because I didn't realize, in a sense, how accurate this was, right? I mean, I didn't realize what an emotional experience this was for so many Jews in the United States and around the world. So that was the sort of really disturbing thing about publishing this book. on the positive side, I now have spoken to a lot of non-Jewish audiences about this book. So both just mainstream audiences, like for, interview with the mainstream, publication or media, or just speaking to general audiences, but also like sort of specifically not non-Jewish audiences, like, like a podcast that's for a Black community audience, or, I've been on Christian TV, like, these kind of like audiences that are like very specifically, really not specifically not Jewish. What's been amazing to me about that is discovering like there's a lot of people with a lot of goodwill who really want to be good allies and kind of just don't know how, because there's a lot of ignorance about the Jewish community in the wider world. And it's not like malevolent ignorance. It's really just, and that's part of what I talk about in the book is like, for a lot of people, the only thing they know about Jews is that they got murdered in the Holocaust, and that's pretty much the beginning and end of what they know.
And I'm trying to remember if it was something that you and I spoke about privately, or if it's something that you've written about. This idea that, all through, let's just for the sake of discussion, say public school in America, that you learn about all of these civilizations. You learn about the Greeks and the Romans and, all these people who are touted as wonderful, great civilizations. In the meantime, the footnote that never gets mentioned in any of this teaching is that in every generation, these people have tried to kill us, and whether kill us physically or just kill us in terms of our identification as Jews. And so I'm sorry that I don't remember if that's you and me talking or if that's the book or something else, but it goes to your point that you're making now.
Yes. So, yes, it's something I have spoken about a lot. I'm realizing that, I don't know if I sort of gave sort of the synopsis of what this book really is about. But maybe to frame what you're saying, this book really is like an exploration of like of this role that Jews play in the dead Jews play in the world's imagination. And part of it is that erasure that you're talking about in what you just said about sort of, we learn about great civilizations, that Jews are erased from this picture. So the book sort of explores these different situations where there's this kind of erasure that's happening, and also where people are telling stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And the book goes from like, contemporary events. It talks about contemporary anti-Semitic attacks in the United States. It talks about sort of historical events. It talks about sort of the mythologies that are built into the American Jewish community, like the myth of Ellis Island. I travel around the world. I go to Jewish heritage sites around the world, which, as I say in the book, it's a great marketing term. It sounds so much better than, property seized from dead or expelled Jews. Like, who wants to go to that? I explore this in literature. I'm sort of comparing Yiddish and Hebrew literature with non-Jewish languages and the way they depict Jewish experience. So, and then it goes to like really contemporary stuff that's happening just before the pandemic. So, this is a book that sort of takes you through this sort of exploitation of Jewish history and memory and the distorted ways that Jews are used as a symbol instead of being regarded as humans. So to go to what you said, Jordana, about sort of, that we learn about these great civilizations. And then, what's not mentioned is like, all of them try to, destroy Jewish civilization at some point in the process. I do think there's like an education problem, which is that if you think about, yes, and this is something that I have said in various contexts. I don't know if it was in conversation with you or in, other, in other contexts, but
all of the above.
Yes, all of the above. Yes, I rant about things, and once I get on something, I
just mean that this is something that we talk about. Yes, for sure. It's a preoccupation.
Yeah, and as parents too, it's with children in school. So, if you think about like, what do people learn in a middle school or high school history textbook about Jews? If it's a book that has ancient history in it, then maybe there's a page about the Israelites. Doesn't mention that those people are Jews. They're just, dead people from a long time ago. Who cares? If it's a textbook with modern history, it might have a chapter about the Holocaust. I mean, it probably does have a chapter about the Holocaust. So, what we learn is Jews are people who got murdered, and their murders are here to teach us something, right? And so this is sort of like, and so what this means, what's interesting about this is that in sort of imposing this Holocaust curriculum on people, the goal of that was to sort of, in a lot of the inclusion of Holocaust curriculum was promoted by the Jewish community. And I think rightly so, really to sort of as a way of inoculating the public against anti-Semitism, The problem is when that's in isolation, and that's the only thing you learn about Jews, the Jews sort of become this like symbol for the limits of civilization, and that using the Jews as a symbol itself is a form of dehumanization, because then the Jews are not agents in this story. They have no role in this story other than to sort of be a battle between non-Jews and how they react to a circumstance, right? It's like they're not actors in the story. And that, I think, is sort of a huge problem with the way we educate people about Jews. And I think that you see the fallout in many, many contexts in contemporary life.
Yes, absolutely. There's so many, that's such a ripe ground to go in so many different directions. I guess that I'll start on this track, but then I'm going to take us back. So what I'm going to say is that, as you said, a lot of what made this book so powerful with people who read it is that it articulates things that people, they know through the lens of their own personal experiences of being Jewish, yet they never put words to. And so here you've presented this, this host of examples to prove your thesis. And it does so very well. But one thing that resonated a lot with me was that in your chapter about the Auschwitz Museum exhibit, you give voice to the idea that as much as we educate people about violence against Jews, it doesn't actually seem to make it stop happening. So, so I want you to speak a little bit to that and about what you hope to accomplish with this book.
Yes. Well, so as I mentioned, like one of the main premises that I explore in this book is that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves, and that process often requires the erasure of actual Jews. And I have to say that one of those stories that people tell about dead Jews that makes them feel better about themselves is Holocaust education, because if you think about it, like, you go to a Holocaust museum or you learn about this in school and hopefully you feel sad about what happened, but you feel great about yourself because, like, we all look great compared to Nazis, right? Like, go me. I'm like, you go to that museum, you're like, I would never do this. It's like, okay, yeah, hooray for you. You probably wouldn't.
It's a low bar.
Yeah, right? I mean, that's a very low bar to clear. And what's interesting, though, is that that's used as the bar. Like, if you think about, every time there's a public figure who says something vaguely anti-Semitic, there's this public ritual where we take them to a Holocaust museum and then they come out and they have to make an announcement that Nazis are bad. Low bar to clear. You don't have to, it's cost free. You don't have to engage with living Jews. You don't have to engage with anybody alive now, right? All you have to do is say Nazis are bad. And so in the book, in that chapter, I have a section where I sort of say, like, here's a bunch of things that aren't the Holocaust. And I list everything from like trolling Jews on social media to, expelling Jews from entire countries and seizing all their assets, which happened like in a dozen countries in the Arab world in the 20th century, which, by the way, is something I also explore in the book. I have a chapter about, there's this digital project called Diarna to rebuild or sort of reconstruct Jewish heritage sites, so to speak, in the Muslim world, or in the Islamic world, rather. So, this is a widespread phenomenon, but all of those things somehow become like, oh, they're no big deal because they're not the Holocaust. And what's interesting is when you look at those things, what we've taught people is that anti-Semitism consists of murdering 6 million Jews. I mean, that's like a kind of absurd standard. And then you have this sort of situation where, like, anti-Semitism is only associated with violence. And we have this idea that educating people about the Holocaust is going to erase it. And as I put it in the book, when somebody's trolling you on social media by photoshopping you into a gas chamber, the problem is not that person doesn't know about the Holocaust.
Right. That person's very aware.
Yes.
Of the Holocaust.
Yes. And so, what I'm thinking about is like and what I want to be clear too is that I'm not saying that Holocaust education causes this. I mean, that's not the problem. But what I'm saying is that it is now, there's this abuse of Holocaust education where it is regarded as an education about anti-Semitism, which is not what it is.
Right. And also the idea of it as a one-stop shop kind of thing is very problematic.
Yes.
And I want to, there's so much to talk about here, and I'm so sorry that I'm going to be like racing all over the place, because one chapter that I'd like you to talk about, how it offends many Jews, is the one where you delve deeper into blowing up that much beloved myth that Jews had their names changed by some hapless clerk at Ellis Island when they came to America. So I'd love for you to talk about that and how that story plays into your general thesis.
Yes. So this I have a chapter called Legends of Dead Jews, where I talk about what I call the myth of Ellis Island, which, as you just said, Jordana, is that story that so many American Jews hear in their families that, some bumbling clerk at Ellis Island changed my family's name from this super Jewish sounding one to a super not Jewish sounding one. It never happened. Nobody's names were changed at Ellis Island. Nobody at Ellis Island wrote down people's names. This isn't my secret research. They announced this on public tours of Ellis Island National Park. And not only that, but we have tens of thousands of court records from after Ellis Island closed in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s of American Jews going to court to change their own names. But what's really interesting to me about that is that people are so attached to this story, because whenever I speak about this publicly, American Jews get really mad at me. They're all like, oh, my great-grandfather must be the exception. He wouldn't lie. Spoiler, your great-grandfather was not the exception. He totally lied. And so what's interesting to me about this is these are people who are like educated, skeptical people who wouldn't accept this kind of, Looney Tunes mythology about anything else. This story's doing emotional work for people. And that was intentional, because the historian Kirsten Vermeglich, she has a great book called Rosenberg by Any Other Name, where she tracks these court filings. And what she finds is, these were not people who are running away from their Jewish identity. They would be members of synagogues, and then they'd go back to the synagogue and be like, I'm paying my dues this year under this new name, right? These weren't people who were fleeing Jewish identity.
Right. But
then it's really interesting. Why did these people change their names? They're staring down a reality they can't avoid. And that reality is American anti-Semitism. Today we talk about anti-Semitic incidents. In 1940, it wasn't about incidents. It was you couldn't get a job.
Right.
Right. You couldn't rent an apartment. You couldn't stay in a hotel. So, these are life-limiting things. And what's amazing to me is that the reason these people created this legend about the clerk at Ellis Island, it was to protect their descendants from psychological damage. Right. It perpetuated this belief that, there's this American exceptionalism that we always have been welcome here. And it worked, because I feel for people our age, every time you hear about something, evidence of anti-Semitism in America, you're like, this must be some mistake. This can't possibly be true.
Right. And in other words, the myth making made something that revealed a very uncomfortable truth, the kind of uncomfortable truths that you package very well in this book, made it more palatable and made it something that you could live with, because it didn't implicate you at all in any kind of self-erasure. It didn't do anything to impute any ill motives to anyone. Just a bumbling, misspelling clerk who couldn't spell the name Gold was at the root of your
Cohen, not hard to spell.
Right, yeah. Exactly. So talking about America, you mention in the book that your children, my children, our children's experience of being Jewish in America looks very different from how we probably thought it would look when we decided to have them. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about what that means, and about what you think America will look like for our children's Jewish children?
I'm not a prophet.
No, full disclaimer.
Yeah. Yes. Well, what's interesting, is that I think we have, again, with that belief in American exceptionalism, we also have this belief of the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And there's this linear progression. I don't really see evidence of that in Jewish history. In Jewish history, there's this like cyclical thing that happens, often the cycles are quite long, so you may not perceive them in a lifetime. But, like people will say things to me like, oh, how can you even say that anti-Semitism is even relevant today in the United States when we have Supreme Court justices who are Jewish and, senators and, major leaders in the culture are Jewish.
The second gentleman, Dara. Don't forget the second gentleman.
I was like, except that all of those things were also true in 12th century Egypt.
Mm.
And also all those things were also true in 10th century Iberia and 10th century Spain, right? All those things were also true in, 6th century Babylonia. It's like, this is sort of this is a very long, history. This is like a very cyclical pattern. What happens in the next like 5 years, 10 years, 100 years is like kind of like the wrong way to look at this, in my opinion. But I mean, it is very disconcerting, though, I think, for people your age and mine who did grow up with this like very profound belief in that American exceptionalism, to really see that like when we were growing up, like the synagogues didn't have like this apparatus of security 24/7, that like our children now, when they go to shul, like that's their normal, right? Is like,
correct. You and I were the last people, well, maybe not the last forever, but the last people in recent memory to celebrate Simchat Torah, dancing with Torahs in the street on West End Avenue.
Yes. Right. They shut that down after the 9/11 attacks. And
yes.
I remember always thinking, like, when are they going to open this back up again? And they never did.
Right.
They never did. So that's one way. And another way is sort of like, what our children are growing up with also is, of course, with social media. There's this situation where like you see what everyone's thinking. And that's a piece that like I don't really know enough to process, because I like when I was in my 20s, I used to have summer jobs at magazines where I was like the dopey summer intern, where one of my jobs was like to read all the letters to the editor and help weed which ones we were going to print. We would get these like bananas, like racist or anti-Semitic letters at these magazines, but we didn't print them.
Right.
And, now it's like every person who was writing those stupid letters, like now they're printing them. Right. And like, our children are seeing them, right. In many, many different forms. And so that sort of, to me, it's like, I don't know whether it's that whether, things have gotten worse or whether we just have a technology now where it's easier to see what people are thinking. It's a little hard for me to tell. But, I do think that there is sort of a different, there is a different dynamic for our children than there was for us, for sure. And that's very troubling to me.
Agreed. And the longer you can stay off TikTok, I think the better your life will be. I think one of the many amazing things about this book is that I believe that once you've read this book, you can't unsee that its underlying ideas are true. You see them everywhere. Things like the Tennessee School Board taking mouse out of the curriculum. Or now, I think just yesterday, I read Disney Plus is making a new miniseries about the people who helped hide Anne Frank and her family, the protectors. So all of these things are now, once you've read this, these things are extremely unsurprising. So what do you want people to do with this new sense of awareness of systemic anti-Semitism and their newfound weariness with the world?
Yes. Well, so just to go to what you're exactly saying and how it plays into the book with these incidences, is I talk a lot in the book about how, as I said, people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. That's part of that is the whole idea of these these Holocaust stories being inspirational. They're not inspirational, right? And the Holocaust is a story of the triumph of evil. And you see that desire to, and I write about this much more deeply in the book about that. It goes much deeper than Holocaust memorialization, because I have a chapter in the book where I talk about narrative arcs in Jewish and non-Jewish literature. Yeah. My doctorate's in Yiddish and Hebrew literature, and I was doing my PhD in comparative literature. There's all this stuff we had to read in literary theory about narrative arc and how, there's this idea that the good guys have to be saved. Everybody, the main character has to have an epiphany. You have to have a moment of grace. These are all Christian terms. This idea that you have to like wrap up a narrative in a bow and give somebody some moment of hope at the end. None of the writers in Yiddish and Hebrew were doing those things. right? I mean, like the writers I was studying, that they had a totally different narrative arc that was based on the idea of endurance and resilience. So in terms of like what I want to give readers about this, yes, you can't unsee this once you see this. And I think that one thing is just clarity. Because, what's amazing to me is that, these were things that like, I'm a pretty educated person. I have a chapter in the book about sharing, and for reasons not worth explaining, I ended up listening in the car to a BBC radio production of The Merchant of Venice with my 10-year-old son. Highly unrecommend doing that. But in the book, when I write about this in the book, I realized like I had, there's all this gaslighting around that play, for example, right? That like, oh, it's not really anti-Semitic. It's just a product of its time. Look at this great speech Shylock gives where he says, I am a Jew. How hath not a Jew hands, eyes, organs? Like, oh, look how it's humanizing him. Even my 10-year-old son was like, Mom, this is an evil supervillain monologue, right? Like, he's like, yeah, this is what like the Joker says before he goes to kill Batman, right? Like, this is not, and it was so obvious to him. And I realized how deep that gaslighting went that like I felt compelled to figure out some, reason to excuse this, right? And so part of it is I'm giving my readers that clarity, right? That like to be able to sort of see the ways in which maybe they have unconsciously been sort of complicit in this problem, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish readers. So to really give people that awareness. So that's the first piece. But then also, I also am in presenting this idea that there is a different kind of narrative arc that you can provide to people. And that's part of what people often ask me this about like, what's your solution to this problem? And then I make this tasteless joke where I'm like, are you looking for the final solution to the Jewish problem?
Dara.
I'm not going to provide that.
I didn't want you.
But I didn't stop myself. But what I really, I have thought about this more, and I think there are ways that we can flip this narrative. And what I mean by flipping this narrative is that, like, think about and I talked a little earlier, we spoke about, the way that, like, you only meet Jews in your high school history textbook when they're, like, being shoved into a gas chamber. That's the first time you meet them. And what I've thought about is, like, what would it mean if we were to sort of expand the way we teach people about Jewish civilization? And, because, why is this only appearing at the end of the high school history textbook? You could say, oh, there aren't that many Jews in the world. Okay, but Jewish culture is central. It's foundational to Western civilization. You don't have Christianity and Islam without Judaism, right? So much of like the whole history of the West is foundational. Its foundation is Judaism. But at the same time, Judaism is this counterculture that weaves its way through the history of the West. And so think about what it would mean if we were to actually expose people to the content of that culture. Because what you're really saying, you're presenting people with a possibility. It's really a challenge to the idea of what does it mean to live in a pluralistic society? And I've been rambling a little bit here, but I could talk about this in the context of what I talk about at the end of the book, the attacks on the Hasidic community that happened just before the pandemic. This is was really revealing to me because, there were these attacks on what I did at the point that those attacks started happening was I read all the news articles about those attacks. And what I found is that I could not find a news article that didn't say something derogatory about the community being attacked in the process of reporting the attack. So, the examples of this are, in Jersey City, where there was a shooting at a Hasidic-owned grocery store, a kosher grocery store. All of those articles about that attack would say, these Hasidic Jews were gentrifying a minority neighborhood. And I'm thinking, are people walking into Blue Bottle Coffee with automatic weapons and blowing away white hipsters? Is this really a trend in America? Because I haven't seen that. Why are we pretending that this is about gentrification? It's obviously not. These people are not white hipsters. And then, same thing in the slashing attack in Muncie, New York. This is upstate New York, where there's a lot of huge Hasidic community. There's an attack just before the pandemic. Somebody walked into a crowded Hanukkah party with a machete and started just slashing people. You read the news articles about that, and they're like, well, there was this zoning battle between the Hasidic and non-Hasidic residents of this town. I'm like, yeah, people just had to have it out with a machete. These articles are sending a signal. The signal is these people deserve it. So when I say about flipping the narrative and about, I think that what this really is a challenge to the way we think about teaching people, anti-bigotry education. I think there's a fatal flaw in the way we have taught people this, which is that we have taught people that, see this group over here that you might be prejudiced against. You shouldn't hate those people because they're just like you and me. They're just like everybody else. Like, that's the message that we've sent. The problem is Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everybody else, right? And then are you really teaching people that like they only can have empathy or only can not slash with a machete people who are exactly like them?
Right.
Because that's kind of what we're saying. And so, I think that what we need to sort of start doing instead is dump this idea that anti-bigotry education is about, everybody is all the same. Because that's very dehumanizing and damaging. And, also take on this idea that like, living in a pluralistic society is about curiosity about human differences.
Yes. And so I want to go to, there are a lot of questions that I want to speak to, and a lot of people are asking questions about that speak to that point. The idea of Heidi asks, how can we teach all types of young people about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism generally, and make it feel relevant to them, if not doing it the way that you're decrying. I mean, she didn't say that explicitly because she wrote the question before you said it. So.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think that there's this flaw in this idea that like you only can have empathy for somebody who's just like you. Like, our role, if we're educating people, should be to be educating them toward curiosity, right? I mean, that curiosity is very, very powerful. And I think that we're erasing it. And I think that what you already see that's not how, many other groups in this country think about educating about diversity. I don't talk about this in the book, but I do in the podcast. I talk about that exhibit in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, the children's exhibit, Daniel's Story, where you walk through this kid's house and it's like this German-speaking boy in Frankfurt. And, he's got his soccer trophies on the wall and his dad's war medals. And then, they take you to the ghetto or whatever. What's amazing to me about that exhibit is like, why do we have Daniel's soccer trophies on the shelf? Why don't we have his copies of the Mishnah? Or why don't we have his Zionist scouting uniform from his Zionist scouting group? Like, why do we have dad's war medals? Why don't we have dad's tefillin? Why don't we have dad's or dad's tickets to the Yiddish theater, right? Like, part of the Nazi project was erasing Jewish civilization. Why are we participating in that project? By also erasing Jewish civilization. 80% of the people who murdered in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. That was the culture that was destroyed in the Holocaust. We didn't have like this destruction of soccer playing kids. We had a destruction of Yiddish civilization, right? Like, and also like, a lot of the people murdered in the Holocaust were Hasidim. Does that change the way you feel about these people?
Correct. They did not look like you and I.
No, they didn't.
That doesn't make the loss.
But what that means, and not only that, but also, why engage in this dehumanization of erasing that culture and adding to that erasure? And to the questioner who asked about like, well, how can we make people feel empathy for people who aren't just like them? Well, isn't that kind of the point of education? Is curiosity about different experiences, number one. Number two, that experience has a lot to offer to the world. I'm going to give like sort of what I feel like is like one of the, a little hopeful message here for those people who have absorbed that, Christian narrative.
You can give your hopeful message, and then I'm going to go to questions about Jewish villainy. But go ahead. Let's go with hopeful.
Should we go with hopeful? Okay, so what I want to say is that non-Jewish cultures, like there are people who have encountered something. Those who have encountered in Jewish culture something beyond just like the Holocaust. They already know that there's a lot to learn from Jewish culture. Simple example, something that happened to me 5 years ago. I mentioned I'm an academic. I was at a conference for Hebrew scholars in Seattle. It's all American Jewish and Israeli Jewish academics talking about Hebrew studies, except for three people. 3 people came to this conference who are not Jewish academics. They're sitting in the back of the room taking careful notes. These people were from the Wampanoag Nation. That's the Native Americans who were from Eastern Massachusetts. They're the ones who first encountered the Pilgrims, right? These people were at this Hebrew conference because they were trying to revive Wampanoag language as a spoken language that hadn't been spoken in like 250 years. And they're at this Hebrew conference because they're like, we want to know how you did it. Because Hebrew is the only language in the history of the world that's ever been revived from being a dead language to being now, a native language for millions of people. So, people are, it's already clear, even when you know very, very little, that there's a lot to learn from this civilization. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't expect children to be curious about it.
I think that's absolutely right. And so one question that neatly dovetails into this is that Peter asks, he says, the movie An Education was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Picture. It's one of the most anti-Semitic movies ever made, not by Nazis, and barely a single reviewer even mentioned the Shylock-like central villain who's a Jew, only because he's named as a Jew. Jews serve the Brits and similar cultures very well as others. In truth, Jews are others. So isn't the best move then to teach the value of others and diversity for evolutionary survival and for innovative ideas and divergent thinking? Isn't that the hope of the 21st century? And I think you would say yes.
Yes. And in fact, in one of my essays in the book, I talk about how what I do feel, I'm not going to give you some secret reason of why is anti-Semitism so persistent, but I do think that Judaism, as I said, is this counterculture that runs through the history of the West. And what it reveals in societies wherever Jews have lived, in non-Jewish societies, is the frightening prospect of freedom, right? Because what the presence of Jews in these non-Jewish societies really suggested and raised was that actually you don't need to believe everything your neighbors believe in order to live your life on this planet, right? Actually you don't have to conform, right? Actually it is possible to have a diversity of opinion, and that's also something that is built into Jewish culture within Jewish culture. So, at the end of the book, I talk about embarking on Daf Yomi, the study of a page of a Talmud a day. You study one page of the Talmud a day and you finish in a very reasonable 7.5 years. One of the reasons the Talmud is so damn long is because it gives you every person's opinion, not just the people who won the argument. And there's this idea, there is this sort of, recognition of diversity, and that part of human thriving is a variety of opinions and a variety of ways of being in the world. And so absolutely, I do think the 21st century way to teach people how not to be bigoted is to understand that diversity is the key to freedom and human flourishing.
I'm going to wed two questions together from people who probably have never met or will never actually, if they're Jewish, maybe there's a degree of separation, who knows? So Bruce asks, people may love dead Jews, but do they love dead and living bad Jews even more? Like Bernie Madoff, Jeffrey Epstein, Meyer Lansky, and what are the implications of that for others' views of Jews? And Jan asks, can you give your thoughts about why anti-Semitism so powerfully persists, even in areas where there are no Jews, even before modern social media?
Okay, wow. So, those two things are very, as by putting them together, you sort of acknowledge they're connected, right? Because the obsession with as you said, dead bad Jews is, that's in itself a product of anti-Semitism. Because thought we all kind of learned that, you don't just take one person out of a group of millions of people and be like, this person is the representative of this group, right? I mean, there's a reason people are doing that. So that's, that whole idea of Jews being villains or something is something that, Shakespeare did an awesome job of depicting that dramatically. Yes, Jews are the villains.
And right now I understand, I haven't seen the Tinder Swindler yet, but I understand that that's the most recent incarnation on Netflix of the Jewish criminal.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of, there's so many, I mean, and that even the recent thing with Anne Frank, where, first of all, I was called, where it's as I put it, achievement unlocked. We finally cracked the case and figured out how to make the Holocaust the Jews' fault. Hooray. It was so absurd. Absurd enough that I think they're even pulling the book. So yeah. But to sort of the question about sort of the persistence of anti-Semitism, even in places where there aren't any Jews. Yeah, I mean, I have an episode on my podcast. I have a podcast, Adventures with Dead Jews. Tells totally different stories from the ones in the book because, there's this topic is bottomless. I have an episode about anti-Semitism in Japan. a place where there aren't a whole lot of Jews and never were. So, and this sort of like amazing like way that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories get into the world of Japan. So yeah, I mean, this is like a very versatile kind of hatred. It's sort of because it's a conspiracy theory. So what that means is that instead of being sort of a run-of-the-mill prejudice where you sort of are like, oh, this group of people over here is inferior to me, you also kind of get to feel like, oh, no, it's not that they're just inferior to me. It's also that they're somehow have superpowers and they're these supervillains. And then you get to feel like, oh, I'm punching up, right? Like I'm speaking truth to power by falling for this like stupid conspiracy theory that people have fallen for hundreds and thousands of years. So, yes, I mean, there's sort of many different permutations of this. In the book, I also talk about like two different types of anti-Semitism that I describe by the holidays Jewish holidays that we celebrate triumphs over them. One is Purim and one is Hanukkah. So Purim is like this anti-Semitism where it's like totally unambiguous. There's some big bad guy who's like, let's kill all the Jews. But then in the Hanukkah story is not about let's kill all the Jews. It's about like this Hellenistic culture that takes over Judea and then imposes its culture on the Jews who live there, who at first are actually participating in assimilating into that culture because that's the way to be a person who matters. And it's sort of Hanukkah anti-Semitism requires Jews to participate in their own self-erasure. In the Hanukkah story, it's so explicit. At one point they build a stadium in Judea and they recruit teenage Jewish athletes to participate in the Greek games. And these boys had to correct their own circumcisions in order to participate in these Greek games. I don't even want to know how that was possible. But I mean, you see this sort of self-editing, very similar to the story about Ellis Island of people changing their names, to succeed in America. Like, it's sort of a question of like, why, what's the motivation? But I mean, I think that you can't discount that this is external pressure from this outside society that's telling you like, how Jewish are allowed to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Somewhere there's a viewer named Deborah whose brain is exploding. She said, my brain is exploding from the fact that I'm realizing that Dara Horn has been living in my brain. And now I'm hearing her articulate with great passion and eloquence so many things that I've been obsessed with. So now I'm thinking about this new LA museum about the movie industry and how the incredible Jewish contribution was simply erased until the tremendous outcry from significant donors. Is that another example?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, there's just so many. It's like I said, this topic is bottomless. I mean, what's interesting about that example is that they're fixing it, right? I mean, that's sort of that's the unusual outcome there is that they actually, responded to that criticism and are changing the exhibit.
Yes, absolutely. And sorry, I'm trying. People in the chat. I'm doing my best. So one person wanted to know, Marta said that she visited the Auschwitz exhibit that you refer to in the book. She found the exhibit to be very moving, and that was the only section of your book that she found troubling. She did not find that the exhibit was proposing universal love. Could you expand a little bit on your views?
Sure. So that exhibit, and as I say in the book, they did everything right. They check all the boxes. There's these world-renowned historians who designed that exhibit. Like they do everything. Tasteful and etc. Like they did everything right. And it made me never want to go to one of these exhibits ever again. What I unpack in that essay is the origins of that exhibit, because, we think of, things like the Holocaust Museum in Washington. These were projects that were funded mostly by Jewish philanthropists like 30 years ago, who were sort of responding to aging Holocaust survivors and also responding to Holocaust denial and wanting to sort of, put up a front against that. That exhibit, the Auschwitz show it was in New York City, just before the pandemic and maybe even in 2020 a little bit as well, it reopened. That exhibit was created by a for-profit European company whose business is blockbuster museum shows. Their other most popular exhibit is the Human Bodies exhibit, which, was very popular about 10 or 15 years ago. That was the one where they had these cadavers that were like injected with dyes and posed, and very controversial exhibit. They also have a very popular exhibit about the Titanic. As I put it in the piece, I was like, this is, of course, not a disaster porn company. It's an education company. Who could argue against education? And, what I realized when I went to that exhibit, you get to the end of that exhibit, and there are these survivors speaking on a loop, like on these video screens, about how people just need to love each other. And I just was so offended by that room because, and by really the whole exhibit leading up to that, this extreme granular detail, because what I felt was that, I'm a PhD in Yiddish. There's a lot of Yiddish literature about the Holocaust by survivors and victims. I can't remember anybody ever talking about love. The Holocaust didn't happen because of a lack of love. It happened because entire societies abandoned, abdicated responsibility for their problems. Right? this has nothing to do with like this take home fuzzy feel good message of we all need to love each other. Right? Mm-hmm. Like that's not what this is about. And, to turn it into this, like, as I said, I think I actually originally wrote it as like, they turned the Holocaust into a Jesus bumper sticker. All you need is love. And, and what I realized is actually this exhibit is not that different from the bodies exhibit. We've got these dead people who are pressed into service to like teach us something, and to me, like, that was just sort of like, it felt so exploitative, and even though like you walk through it and it's just like every other Holocaust exhibit you've ever been to. Maybe it's well done, but like what it made me realize is there's something really missing here, which is, first of all, any acknowledgement of the Ashkenazi civilization that was destroyed, really not part of the exhibit. Don't care about that. Right. And also this, that there is something exploitative about this for-profit European company making this.
Many, many, many people are asking, can you discuss your reaction to the Whoopi Goldberg controversy as well as the backlash to her 2-week suspension?
Sure. So, yes, Rabbi Whoopi Goldberg and her
yes.
Yes. Honestly, like, I just feel like it was, very typical of the ignorance that people have about Jewish history and the history of anti-Semitism. Because, what she said was really not that different from what most people are taught in public school about the Holocaust, right? Like, because it's often taught as this like moment outside of history, right? Like where it becomes this theological question, like where was God? Even when you read like sort of the better books about this, like a book like Night, I talk about in my book about when Elie Wiesel wrote Night the first time, he wrote it in Yiddish. The title was "And the World Was Silent." And it was a book about political anger. Like, where were the nations of the world that let this happen? When he translated it into French, he adapted it because he's like, what French reader in 1958 is going to want to read about how their society failed? Better to blame God, right? Like, we can all get behind that, right? So, there's this sort of like erasure of the specifics. So, what she said, like, I think it reflects ignorance, but I think that ignorance is unfortunately really typical, and then it also reflects this idea that like this attempt to fit Jews into a box, because, now in our, in American history, like so much of the conversation in American history is about race, because that's such a defining aspect of our history.
Yes.
But, they've always tried, but like every civilization has tried to fit Jews into whatever their box was. Right? Napoleon tried this. In 1806, he convened the Sanhedrin, the ancient rabbinic court that hadn't met in 2,000 years. Napoleon created a Sanhedrin for all the Jews in the French Empire to get them together to pledge their loyalty to the French Empire and to promise that for them, Judaism was only going to be a religion. We're not going to do this like, national group thing. We're not going to do this corporate identity thing. Promise me, you guys, that we're just going to be a religion, because that was like what was important there. So, there's sort of like this, all of these societies are trying to impose their identity from the outside in. And that to me is the problem. So, this particular individual who's a celebrity and whatever, like, this is now a public ritual we do. But, I think it's honestly emblematic of a lot of people's ignorance.
Marcia asks, I think that progressive thinking people minimize anti-Semitism and its impact because there doesn't appear to be an economic effect. Jews are seen as thriving professionally and financially, especially in relation to people of color. What are your thoughts?
So I'm going to bump you to another writer who I just did an event with on Sunday, David Baddiel. He's a British Jewish comedian. He wrote a book called Jews Don't Count, which is very exactly about this particular problem, which is anti-Semitism in the progressive movement. I would throw, what he does in that book is he throws back, he says, actually, you know who the wealthiest minority ethnic group is in the UK and in the US? Hindus. But like, nobody's like, well, they have money, so, they aren't experiencing discrimination. You know who's another really wealthy group? Gay men, 2 male incomes, not less true for other LGBTQ, maybe not, but like gay men have very high incomes. Nobody's ever like, well, you got double male income in your household. Like, you don't have there's no discrimination against you. Like, nobody's saying these things. And the reason that people are saying it about Jews is it is an enactment of an anti-Semitic trope, because the whole idea, one of the animating aspects of anti-Semitism is this idea that Jews have too much power. So that is an anti-Semitic idea that is behind all of the erasure of contemporary anti-Semitism within the progressive movement. So that's one piece. Another piece that I want to sort of just call people's attention to is, often it's within the progressive movement, often anti-Semitism will hide under the guise of anti-Zionism. And I'm just bringing this up. There's a whole other can of worms. But one way I explore this in my book is just to point out historically that this idea comes from the Soviet Union, from before the state of Israel, from the 1920s, when the Bolsheviks created the Jewish sections of the Communist Party to get the masses of Jews in the former Russian Empire on their side. Their slogan was, "We are not anti-Semitic, we are just anti-Zionist." And of course, in the process of not being anti-Semitic and just being anti-Zionist, they managed to, persecute, imprison, torture, and murder thousands of Jews. And then they exported this slogan to their client states in the developing world in the later 20th century. So then you end up with this like Zionism is racism at the UN. There's a very long history of this idea. And it also goes back to Karl Marx, who, wrote this like screed about, how, Jews represent money and evil power, muhahaha. So this is very old in many different parts. It's everywhere in the political spectrum. You can find a different version.
Regina asks, how would you suggest that we begin in educating our non-Jewish friends and becoming advocates for ourselves? Also, what literature besides your book and David Baddiel's, I'll add that, would you recommend to read to learn more about our history and our culture?
Well, if you have and I realize if you have the audiobook, it may not be there, but in the printed version of my book, I have a bibliography. Which are all the books that I refer to in my book. So I'm not claiming that that's like your great starting list, but like there are many resources for this kind of thing. If you go to like My Jewish Learning or something like that, they have whole bibliographies of like entry level like Jewish literacy books, entry level Jewish history books. Like, so I don't have a particular skin in the game of what to recommend for that. But I think that introducing people to the content of Jewish life is the most important thing here and the most effective thing. And if that means that you yourself have to become more educated in Jewish life, then that's a win too, because then you're about to explore something that you haven't known before about a 3,000-year-old civilization. I'm going to give the example of this that, we all, as I mentioned earlier, we have this public ritual that we do when anybody, public figures say something anti-Semitic, and then we have to drag them to a Holocaust museum, and then they say Nazis are bad, blah, blah. An interesting counter example to that is the example of Derek Black. Do you remember this story? This was from maybe 2017, a few years ago. This was a young man he was the son of a white nationalist leader. And not just the son of a white nationalist leader, he was being groomed to be the new leader after his father, after his father moved on. He was like speaking at these these white supremacist rallies all the time. He was like the poster boy for this white nationalist movement. He was a college student in Florida. And on his campus, there were Jewish students who at some point figured out who he was. And were like, what do we do? Do we like out him? Do we like tell everybody, oh, this like neo-Nazi leader is on our campus? They didn't do that. Like, do we throw a bunch of Holocaust literature in his face? No. Instead, they invited him to Shabbat dinner. And he came. And then they just kept inviting him. Week after week, they kept inviting him to Shabbat dinner. They eventually became friends. This young man denounced white nationalism, wrote a book about it, how he sort of came to realize, like, that these were his friends and that they had a really, not just like, oh, they're just like you and me, but that they had this interesting culture that was really very beautiful and had a lot to offer to the modern world. So, that's, I don't know how scalable that is. But I think that idea of connecting to another person to share sort of really the riches of Jewish civilization is something really powerful and something that we sort of, because of Jewish history, we often are reluctant to do. But I think that there's a lot of power to be gained from that.
Yes. And I apologize to all the people whose questions I didn't get to. I'm very sorry.
All 1,300 of you.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, I did what I could. But I would say that One, Hannah says, it says a lot about internalizing anti-Semitism that I'm dreading giving your book to fellow progressive non-Jewish friends. Have others lost friendships over this, having to choose between convincing others that anti-Semitism even exists or continuing to prove that we are the good guys who support the other downtrodden? We hold up Heschel, marching in Selma more than defending against anti-Semitism.
I mean, I think that myth that anti-Semitism doesn't exist is doing emotional work for us too. And as Jordana, as you said earlier, like you read this book and it's like, once you see this, you can't unsee it. I don't think the solution is to remain ignorant. I mean, that would be nice, right? But I don't think that's the solution. I think that there is a conversation to be had. And if I can say anything encouraging about this, it's that I have had those conversations, with readers. And I have found that there is so much goodwill that I did not expect to find. And part of the reason I didn't expect to find it is because of what I know about Jewish history. Like I wasn't expecting to find goodwill. There are a lot of people who want to be good allies. And, one thing when we talk about in the progressive movements, one thing that I've discovered is a lot of people from other minority groups read this book and are like, wow, I feel seen. You're speaking my language and now I get it. That's sort of been something very gratifying to me. I was speaking to somebody who was running a school, who was a principal of a school in Canada that was, most of the student body is Indigenous students. And she was saying, she wanted to bulk buy the book for her school. Because she's like, my students need this because they don't have the language for this. This is what they're going through in their lives, right? This kind of co-opting of the history and this sort of marginalization of the living people. And they're like, and how they've internalized that. Like, she's like, they don't know how to talk about that. And this gives them the language. And I had a very similar experience speaking with, some podcasts that are addressing the Black community. Very similar kind of response of like, you're speaking my language. There's a lot of room for allyship here. And I will say on the, maybe perhaps a different end of the political spectrum, I've been on Christian TV. And in these, and I've done those sort of Christian media, radio interviews and things like that. And like, people really want to do the right thing.
Dara, do you really believe that people, in spite of everything, are good at heart?
No, I don't. But I don't believe that.
Sorry, that was an insider Anne Frank joke for those.
Yes, well, because as I say in the book, Anne Frank, the simple, people think that line is inspiring in Anne Frank's diary, but actually, it's just the reality is so much simpler. Like Anne Frank wrote that line about people being good at heart 3 weeks before she met people who weren't. So yeah, no, I don't really think people are good at heart, but I think that there are a lot of people who just don't know anything. And, maybe people could be good at heart. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential. I think there's a lot of human potential. And that to me is something really encouraging. And I think that right now in the United States, we are in this moment where, we are having these, sometimes fraught conversations about American history. And I think that, Jews have a lot to add to this conversation and should really not be afraid of participating in it. Thank you.
In our in America, we can end with a happy ending. How's that? That's as close as it gets to a happy ending. So I'll throw it back to Marjorie, but thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for the most inspiring hour that we have had in a very, very long time. It was riveting. And as you can see by the comments, I know you can see them, endless, amazing compliments for Jordana, you were moderating, and Dara, everything you've been speaking about. It was really, really a thrill. We had 1,300 people watching the whole time, which is spectacular. So thank you both very much. We all learned a lot. I hope everybody buys this book. It's you need to read it. Again, thank you very much. We hope to have you in person. Hope we can entice you to come in person, both of you, one of the days. And I do want to just speak to the audience for a moment. Thursday night, February 9th, we have Ambassador David Friedman at 7 p.m., which will be also an interesting conversation. And I hope to see everybody back here next Tuesday at 11:30. February 15th to listen to Laura Littman, a completely different type of author, but nevertheless will be very interesting. A lot of fun. I love her books. So thank you, Jordana. Thank you, Dara.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.